So, we've all had a bit of time to ruminate on the first 13 episodes of the 1000-Year Blood War arc, kickstarting the long-anticipated return of the Bleach anime after nearly a decade in the making. Now, with part 2 looming on the horizon, I wanted to take some time to look back at this opening batch of episodes through a critical lens, with a particular focus on the major conflict bubbling at the centre of it all, the first Quincy invasion, considered by many, myself included, to be a true highlight of the entire Bleach story, where Soul Society is pushed to the brink of total collapse by the Vandenreich. I've said it before that I think the 1000-Year Blood War arc is going to be a difficult arc in general to faithfully adapt. It's Bleach at its most wild and its most ambitious, with a scope unlike anything the series had attempted before. The cast of characters has ballooned to astronomical levels as the story tackles a full-scale war of epic proportions for the first time. And honestly, nowhere is that more apparent than in this initial section of the story. So, without further ado, let's dive back into the first part of the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime to see how they did. But before we get started on the video, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach content like this every single week. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well to help support me and the channel. And if you want to take that support for me another step further, I do have a Patreon as well. And as always, I want to give a massive shout out and say a huge thank you to everyone supporting me over there on Patreon. I really do appreciate it. And of course, before we get going on this video, there will be spoilers for this entire first part of the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime to come. Episodes 1 through 13 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc covered chapters 480 through to 542, which is a lot of story content, effectively covering almost the entirety of what I would consider to be the first invasion sub-arc. For reference, I personally tend to split the final arc into 3 sections: the first invasion, the second invasion, and the Varvelt battle. And for context, these episodes pretty much dealt with the whole of that first sub-arc, save for maybe 4 or 5 chapters. What this means is Bleach is off to a better, stronger, and faster start than ever before. Much of the same praise that was levied at the start of this arc in the source material can also be lavished upon this adaptation. The Vandenreich, our newest group of villains revealed to be an empire of Quincy's, make an incredible first impression as their God King Yhwach leads them into unrelenting battle against the Soul Society. An ancient grudge is not only hinted at here in the anime, with the dark secrets of older characters like Yamamoto and Unohana being dredged up to the surface, but actively drawn on in ways that are more effective than in the source material, giving us a deeper understanding of the backstory and context surrounding the war that is this arc's very namesake. Meanwhile, all of our old favourites return. Ichigo and his friends, now more comfortable in their respective roles than ever, lead an invasion into a now occupied Waco Mundo to help rescue the Arrancar from the grip of the heavily militarised Quincy. This notion of former enemies bonding together to fend off a greater threat is only lightly touched upon in the original story, unfortunately, and I imagine it'll be similar here, but what we do get to see is fantastic all the same. When the Vandenreich launch their first invasion in full, the series rightfully descends into chaos, and we're presented with the sight of a Soul Society like we've never seen it before, crushed, emotionally distraught, and completely beaten into submission, but we'll get into that a little later. The anime never lets up, quickly introducing the hugely anticipated and ever mysterious Zero Division, as well as their palace high in the heavens above the Seirete. Ichigo's journey into the palace takes place alongside the rebuilding of the Gotei 13, with numerous strands dangled in front of the viewer as characters start on down their respective paths. This is the busiest Bleach has ever been, and I've always been all for it. The series is more complex here than ever, with multiple subplots happening all at once, ready to converge at the next big conflict. As this first part came to an end, numerous truths were revealed. Unohana battles Kenpachi Zaraki in an effort to help him unlock his hidden power, unveiling her secret nature at the same time, while deep within the palace's forge, the heart of the Zanpakuto itself, himself, Ichigo at last becomes a true Shinigami after hearing the tale of his parents coming together. This first batch of episodes is capped off with an emotionally resonant climax as Ichigo comes face to face with an earth-shattering truth about himself, his understanding of which allows him to reach greater heights as Uryu seemingly joins the enemy in preparation for the war to come. There's a ton of story here, and I think for the most part the anime did an admirable job of covering what it needed to. There's no avoiding the fact that we moved at a brisk pace to fit just about everything in, and while some fat was trimmed, there's a conversation to be had about the overall pacing too, which we'll get into. But as a Bleach fan, and perhaps more importantly, a real fan of the final arc in general, I came away from part 1 wholly satisfied and eager for more. So that was a general overview of the 1000 Year Blood War arc part 1, but I want to take a deeper look at several individual aspects of the series as well, starting with the overall style and art, the presentation. Personally, I have never been happier with how the Bleach anime looks. There's a maturity to the art and a real reverence for Kubo's own style and line art that I don't think we've really seen before. Sure, some sections of the previous anime looked absolutely incredible, stylish, fluid, but never has there been such consistency. Never has there been such an effort to replicate Kubo's own work to where I could pause most shots and get a stunning looking image or drawing. Where the Arrancar arc dragged on for hundreds of episodes, thereby experiencing a wildly fluctuating quality overall and dramatic increases and decreases in standard at seemingly sporadic intervals, all 13 episodes of the final arc so far have looked great. And admittedly, some even look better than others, but I'm very pleased to see a through line of genuine quality here. Of course, in terms of visuals, episode 6, The Fire, is a stunning showcase of how a Bleach fight can look, but I also really enjoyed episodes 1, 7, 10, and 13 in terms of their presentation too. The new anime also took some risks artistically, most of which I think completely paid off. I really appreciated the often dramatic and more realistic lighting used throughout, helping to make each scene and set piece look and feel totally different. Did it always work? Maybe not, but some scenes, like the final showdown of the first invasion and the following night focusing on the 4th Division, as well as the battle between Unohana and Zaraki, hit even harder as a result. When it comes to audio, I'm impressed, though I was hoping for maybe a little more variety. Most of the remixes, however, are great, and I was, on a personal level, very pleased to hear my favourite Bleach track, Nightmare, make a return. Of course, bookending the episodes with number 1 is a great decision as well for hyping up the community. The new tracks for the Vandenreich are incredibly fitting. I especially enjoy the sinister renditions of the ringing church bells. Honestly, it doesn't get much more perfect than that. Then there's the new opening and ending, Scar by Tatsuya Kitani and Saihate by Senna Rin. Personally, I think they were both fantastic. I've seen people criticize the new opening in particular as being too generic, but I really enjoyed it and its accompanying visuals. It was the kind of action-packed display I wanted from the first invasion, and the ending was uniformly great as well, showing the darker side of the battle, reflecting on the loss experienced by the Soul Society. Replacing the many warriors with just their swords is a solemn but evocative touch. Character voice acting, at least in the Japanese version as that's what I watched, was universally excellent, but I have to give praise to certain new characters who I felt really made an impact. Yuha voice actor does an excellent job, I think, transitioning from Zangetsu to the Quincy King, lending his voice true gravitas and weight, while Kirige OP couldn't have been given a more perfect actor. Pompous, eccentric, yet with an undercurrent of pure malice. And then there's Asnot, a character who I could never quite pin a voice down for in my head. But what we got was wonderful, a grisly, gravelly voice that crawls all over you in a slow, creeping fashion. In fact, most of the Sturmritter sound great, but they've yet to come into their own. Next, I want to highlight several characters who I felt were absolute standouts during this first part of the 1000 Year Blood War. Up first, we need to of course talk about Ichigo himself. Ichigo goes through quite the journey in this arc, and nowhere is his range of emotions more on on display than in this first section of the story. From his confidence and courage early on, before his utter desperation when trapped in the Garganta, to his explosive rage when facing off with Yhwach, Ichigo goes through it all in the space of just these episodes, ending the first part with a genuinely moving insight into the story of Isshin and Masaki, and Ichigo's acceptance of Zangetsu and his own powers. Of all the captains on display here, of course, the standout is none other than Yamamoto himself. The spotlight is placed squarely on the head captain throughout the first part of this arc, and the character is afforded the gravity and depth necessary to really sell his seething anger and deep-rooted regret. Yamamoto is a tragic character here, whose failings are all rapidly brought to the forefront after the death of his vice-captain Chojiro, and while I don't think the anime conveyed the softer and quieter aspects of Yamamoto's grief well enough, even going so far as to miss the point with certain scenes, it truly captured his monstrous, almost demonic anger, turning that into a shockingly well-adapted showcase of his true power, his bankai, which will likely go down in Bleach history as one of the anime's most memorable moments. The enemy's king, Yhwach, is an imposing figure whose screen presence is absolutely magnetic. I was a little concerned they wouldn't be able to capture his might, his heft in the anime, but as you can see from these screens, he looks absolutely terrifying, his bulk taking up almost the entire frame at points, which is such a powerful image, and absolutely fitting for an all-conquering warlord. While Yhwach isn't seen all that much here in the first part, I think the anime did a great job introducing this newest villain. But speaking of villains, I want to give yet another shout out to Sternritter J, the Jail Kirige OP. Kirige was so good in the source material that I made an entire video on why he was such an effective introduction to the Vandenreich as a whole, and the same is true yet again here in the anime. Before the battle even gets going in the Seirete, Kirige is here putting on an amazing show, dueling a combination of Ichigo and the Arrancar forces of Hueco Mundo, displaying the fullest extent of a Quincy's abilities, including an impressive holy form, all of which looked stunningly beautiful in the anime. Needless to say, when the time came for Kirige to make his exit from the show, I was sad to see him go. Other characters that I feel made a real impact included Unohana, Akon, Aznot, Byakuya, Zaraki, and the combination of Ichigo's parents, Isshin and Masaki. Plus, it was always nice to see Aizen again. Now, before the anime dropped, I voiced my concerns over their potential handling of the first Quincy invasion. It's one of the best sequences in all of Bleach, and maybe my favourite collection of chapters in the story altogether. I was afraid the anime might not be able to truly capture the fast-paced, chaotic nature of the battle. The idea that Soul Society was fully on the back foot, that so much was happening so rapidly that no one could even really process the fact that enemy soldiers were now walking the streets of Seirete, killing indiscriminately. The fact that we have never seen the Seirete and even the Soul Society itself in such a dire place as this is a huge deal, and this first Quincy invasion contains some of the most emotional beats the story has seen thus far, including of course Yamamoto's extraordinarily downtrodden and sad defeat and death, and of course the wonderful conversation between Ichigo and the very nearly dead Byakuya. All these moments were moments I went into the anime holding my breath for, as they needed to be absolutely perfect. And to begin with, I thought my concerns may have been coming true. Chapter 494, the introduction to the invasion, occurs in the blink of an eye, tacked onto the end of episode 3, which by my count is already perhaps the most sped through episode of this entire first part. Izuru's defeat lacked impact, and while I loved the disorientating, blaring music that played when the Sternritter themselves appeared, I was worried. But things improved, and in the end, the episodes containing the first invasion, 4, 5, 6, and 7, only seemed to get better each and every week. When the captains had their bankai stolen, you could feel the confusion and despair. I adored the additions to their fights, as small as they might have been, and the various hints to the individual powers of the Sternritter. When Byakuya was overcome by Asnod's fear, it was a haunting experience, complete with some of the best visuals of the arc so far. When Yamamoto entered the fray, his anger was palpable, and his entire showdown with Driscoll and his tender memory of Chojuro is masterfully handled, accompanied by one of the best new soundtracks of the series. When Zaraki arrived, carrying 3 Quincy on his back, it was a moment to breathe, a rare picture of triumph among a sea of blood. But of course, for many, the crowning achievement was the battle between Yamamoto and Roidloid. It was a picture-perfect rendition of one of the most prominent fights of the arc, in some ways elevated beyond the page itself, particularly in the depiction of Yamamoto's bankai. And when the time came for Yamamoto himself to die, it was gruesome, an excellent validation for the increased levels of explicit gore the series can now command, but it was also sad, as a bleak greyness blanketed the Seirete. And for me, following on from that, it was really episode 7 that encapsulated the very feel of the first invasion that I had been looking for. As far as I'm concerned, episode 7 totally and utterly nailed the first Quincy invasion. From the sheer overwhelming force of the Vandenreich as the Soldat stormed the streets, to explosions rupturing the buildings and the alleys, to blood splatters caking the tiles, it was, for lack of a better word, perfect. Rain lashed down, soaking everything. The Sternritter used the shadows to summon their allies to the battleground, and Ichigo himself eventually arrived, rescuing Akon, having that extraordinarily quiet, that extraordinarily solemn, that heartfelt conversation with the Byakuya on his deathbed that really helped his development come totally full circle, as there was barely any noise save for the sound of the pitter-patter of rain before eventually facing down the Quincy Emperor himself. The sense of total defeat that washes over the Soul Society as the Sternritter take their leave, smug grins on their faces as they drip back into the darkness as the church bells sound overhead like a reckoning for the Soul Society, was a total showcase of exactly how I wanted the first invasion to both look and feel. So yeah, to answer the question in the title of this review, they did get it right. After an episode or two. But as we begin to round this review out, it'd be remiss of me not to circle back to that ongoing conversation surrounding the pacing and the heavy amount of cut content from the source material. Many of us went into the anime hoping for scenes to be expanded, for content to be added where necessary to flesh out parts of the world and the story that otherwise weren't. I don't think many of us expected quite as many scenes to be cut as they were in the name of faster pacing. And the pacing was extremely fast. We've moved from covering 1 to 2 chapters an episode in the Arrancar arc to approximately 4, 5, or even 6 an episode now. Looking back, 1 to 2 chapters an episode is too little. The pacing then becomes glacial. That sweet spot, as I mentioned in my weekly reviews, is found somewhere around the 3.5 to 4 chapter coverage, which some of these episodes did actually hit and were all the better for it. And while I honestly don't mind some of the comedic scenes being cut, as they were the majority of casualties here, it was disappointing to see some scenes that I would have thought were fairly important to some of this arc's bigger subplots. For example, everything to do with the Vizards in the human world being completely removed. Characters who already do too little in the source material will now do even less. But it wasn't all cuts. There were some much needed additions as well. Some I was so happy to see, they honestly washed away a lot of my concerns and apprehension. From smaller additions like seeing who battled Rukia in the first invasion, to getting that extended fight sequence between Ichigo and Yhwach, and a better showing of Unohana's bankai, to larger additions like finally having a much clearer roadmap for Uryu's character arc, and of course the crown jewel, getting that flashback into the original Gotei 13 and their battle against Yhwach and his Lichtreich 1,000 years ago that adds so much context I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Even if actual details remain thin on the ground, even just having this in the source material would have elevated the conflict so much, so I'm incredibly grateful to have it here. In fact, it was the #1 thing I most wanted to see on my list of changes and additions I'd like the anime to make. Interestingly, this first section of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc is often considered the best by fans, or at least the most consistent. It's possible the anime team cut sections here and there to leave room for bigger, more substantial changes later on down the line in parts of the story that might need it more. But I guess we'll have to wait and see. And so with all that said and done, I think it's safe to say I thought the first part of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc anime was a success. I really enjoyed it week to week, and I think the amount of love and effort being poured into it is obvious. The major tentpole moments hit with the sort of weight and emotion they should, and the series has never looked prettier. While I do think the pacing is a little bit too quick for my liking, and I lament some of the scenes that are being cut, there is some absolutely crazy stuff still yet to come. In fact, the final arc really becomes unshackled from this moment onwards, and I can't wait to see how they tackle it. But if it's anything like what we've seen so far, I think we're in good hands. Alright guys, but that's it for my review, my retrospective, whatever you want to call it, of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc anime Part 1, episodes 1 through to 13. Let me know in the comments below if you agree with my thoughts and feelings regarding this first batch of episodes of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, and of course, how you felt about the anime itself as well. I'd love to hear your comments down below. Make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done already, guys, but until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.